Title: The Unbroken Heart. Chapter 1: The Silent Return. The air in the old house was thick with something unspoken, a heaviness that lingered long after the last of the sun's warmth had bled out of the sky. Ethan had returned. He didn't know why. The impulse had seized him suddenly, dragging him back to this place. A place he thought he had long forgotten. His footsteps echoed through the empty halls, each sound reverberating like a pulse. The house had not changed, but it felt different. It felt alive, breathing, watching him, waiting for him. The floorboards creaked beneath him as if protesting his intrusion, groaning with the weight of his presence. He knew this house. He had lived here once, long ago, but the memories of his time here were fractured, broken, like shards of glass too sharp to touch. He wandered through the familiar rooms, half-forgotten pictures on the walls, furniture draped in white sheets, the smell of dust and old wood permeating the air. Yet, there was something more, an unnatural chill in the air that made his skin crawl, something that didn't belong. Suddenly, a faint sound reached his ears, almost imperceptible at first, a whisper, like a breath against the back of his neck. He spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. The curtains fluttered slightly as though stirred by a breeze, but the windows were shut tight. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the mind, but the whisper came again, closer this time. "Ethan!" His breath hitched, and his body froze, paralyzed by the sound of his name. He had heard it before, in his dreams, in the darkest corners of his thoughts. It was the voice he had once loved, the voice that had once soothed him, had once held him close. Now it was something else. It was different. He stepped cautiously toward the living room, his gaze scanning the shadows, waiting for something, or someone, to emerge. The room was still, but he could feel it. The pulse of the house, the way the walls seemed to breathe with each passing second. Then, there she was, Clara. Her figure appeared in the dim light, standing in the center of the room, her back to him. Her hair cascaded down her back like dark silk, her silhouette almost ethereal, as though she were a ghost. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there, still as the grave. "Ethan!" Her voice was low, reverberating through the room like a slow, creeping fog. "You've come back." He didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat felt dry, his tongue heavy. He wanted to scream, to run, but he was frozen in place. There was something wrong, something terribly wrong. Clara turned slowly, her eyes locking onto his. They were dark, too dark, black as the void. The warmth he had once known in her gaze was gone, replaced by an emptiness that made his stomach twist. She smiled at him, but it wasn't a smile he recognized. It was twisted, almost mocking. "You left me," she said softly. "But you always knew you'd come back, didn't you? We're connected, Ethan. Always have been." Her words sank into him like stones sinking into a bottomless ocean. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His hands trembled at his sides, his body trembling with a fear that gnawed at his insides. "You can't escape it," Clara whispered, taking a step toward him. The space between them seemed to contract with every step she took, her presence growing heavier, more oppressive. "We are bound by something far older than time. We were never meant to be apart." Ethan took a step back, his body moving on its own. But there was no room to escape. The walls seemed to close in on him. Every corner, every shadow seemed to hold a memory of her. Her laughter, her touch, her love. But it wasn't love anymore. It was something darker. Clara's figure flickered for a moment, her face warping, shifting as though the very essence of her were unraveling. Her skin paled to a sickly grey, her eyes hollowing further, becoming pits of darkness. The smile that once held tenderness now stretched grotesquely across her face. Her lips curled, her teeth elongating into sharp points. "I waited for you," she said, her voice dripping with a bitter sweetness. "And now you are mine again." Ethan stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. His legs shook beneath him. His breath quickened, each inhalation more frantic than the last. He wanted to scream, to call for help, but the words stuck in his throat. His vision blurred, the room spinning as though it were about to collapse in on itself. Clara's figure moved faster now, almost too fast. She was at his side in an instant, her cold hand resting on his shoulder. Her touch was icy, like death itself. "You can't leave me, Ethan," she whispered in his ear. "I will never let you go." Her fingers dug into his skin, the cold sinking into his bones. Pain lanced through his body, a sharp, biting sensation that made him gasp. But then, just as suddenly, it was gone. The pain faded, replaced by a suffocating silence. Ethan turned to look at her, his mind racing. She was gone. The room was empty. He was alone. But no, he wasn't. Her voice echoed in his mind, soft and insistent, like a lullaby meant to lull him into madness. "We are bound, Ethan. Bound by blood. Bound by love. Bound by death." The house seemed to shift around him. The walls warped and bent like rubber. The floor beneath his feet groaned, stretching as though the house itself was alive, watching him. Ethan's heart thudded painfully in his chest as the whispers grew louder. They filled the room, filled his mind, filled every inch of his soul. "You can't escape." He tried to move, tried to run, but the house was too big, too vast. The rooms stretched on, endless, shifting and moving, as though the house itself were alive, and it was hunting him. He was trapped. The whispers were louder now, frantic, echoing in his ears. "You can never leave, Ethan. Not now, not ever." And then, as if some unseen force had finally grabbed hold of him, he felt himself pulled forward, into the very heart of the house, into the room where it all began, the room where he had once loved her, the room where she had died. The air grew colder with each step, the walls seeming to close in. He couldn't breathe. His chest tightened, his vision narrowing. His body ached, the pain crawling up from deep within, sharp and searing. And there, in the center of the room, was Clara again. But this time, her eyes were not hollow. They were full of rage, full of hunger, and they were fixed on him. "You can never escape," she hissed, her voice low and guttural. "You are mine." Ethan's breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding in his ears. The walls trembled around him, as if the house were shaking with the weight of some ancient, forgotten truth. "Clara, please," he begged, his voice barely a whisper. "I never meant for this. I never meant to hurt you." But the words felt hollow, empty. She didn't care. She never had. With a chilling smile, Clara took a step toward him, her form flickering once more. "It doesn't matter anymore, Ethan. We are bound. We are one." And then everything went dark. Chapter 2. The quiet beneath the storm had begun to fade, leaving the world beneath a heavy, unsettling stillness. The house, a place he had once known as a home, now felt more like a tomb, silent, hollow, and suffocating. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were watching him, that they had always been watching him. It had been days since Clara's return, days since he had stood in this very house, confronting the twisted semblance of the woman he had once loved. But the questions lingered like an odor that wouldn't leave. What had happened to her? What had happened to them? The house, too, seemed to hold the answer, though it refused to speak. Ethan had tried to leave. The first night had been filled with the frantic rush to escape, to outrun whatever dark force had brought him back here. But every time he reached the door, every time his hand gripped the cold knob, he felt the oppressive weight of something pulling him back. It was a force that lingered just beneath the surface, like a shadow that twisted and writhed every time he turned his back. Now, he sat in the same room where he had first seen Clara, where her image had flickered in and out of existence, her voice a broken melody in his mind. His fingers twitched in his lap, nervously tapping against the armrest of the chair. The air was thick with tension. He could feel it, like static electricity crackling just out of reach, an invisible presence pushing against the corners of his mind. The dim light from the cracked windows barely pierced the darkness that clung to the house. The shadows seemed to deepen as if the house itself were feeding on the blackness, swallowing any trace of light it could find. "Clara," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to himself, to the empty room, or to the ghost that still haunted him. But the name slipped from his lips like a prayer, a desperate plea for some kind of answer. The temperature in the room dropped. He could feel it, the sharp, biting cold that clawed at his skin, curling into his bones. His breath fogged in front of him, and his heart thudded with a quiet panic. There was something here, something he couldn't see but could feel all around him. He wasn't alone. The silence broke. A soft creak echoed through the room, the sound of something shifting in the shadows. Ethan froze, every muscle tense, as his eyes darted toward the corner of the room where the darkness seemed to curl tighter. There was nothing there, but the creaking had been real. Something was moving, slowly, almost imperceptibly. And then, like a whisper in the dark, he heard it, a voice, soft and distant, but unmistakable. "Come closer, Ethan." His heart slammed into his chest as he turned sharply, the air in his lungs suddenly gone. He tried to breathe, tried to steady his thoughts, but they scattered like leaves in a storm. The voice had come from somewhere within the house, but it wasn't Clara's voice. No, this one was darker, rasping with an edge of something ancient, something not human. He didn't know where it came from, but he knew he had to follow it. He didn't want to. Part of him screamed to run, to leave this house before whatever was pulling him deeper had a chance to find him. But another part of him, a darker, quieter part, was drawn to the voice as though it were a siren's call. Compelling, magnetic, impossible to resist. And so, against every instinct telling him to flee, Ethan rose to his feet. His legs shook beneath him, but he forced himself forward, moving through the house with a slow, deliberate pace. He passed through the narrow hallway, his footsteps soft but steady. The air seemed to thicken with every step he took, suffocating him like a dense fog. The house was different now. The walls were no longer static, no longer just inanimate structures. They moved, they breathed, they whispered. "Come closer, Ethan." The voice urged him again, this time louder, more insistent. It echoed in the hollow spaces of the house, reverberating off the walls as though it were coming from the very foundation beneath his feet. He reached the living room, the place where everything had gone wrong. The walls seemed to close in on him, the corners darkening further, as though the house itself was shrinking, folding in on him. The floorboards groaned under his weight, the air thick with dust and something worse, something that made his stomach churn and his throat tighten. "Clara," he breathed again, though the words sounded hollow even to him. What was left of her? Was it her he was searching for? Or something else entirely? But the answer came in the form of a shadow, a flicker at the edge of his vision. He turned, and there she stood, Clara. But not Clara. Not really. Her figure was translucent, flickering in and out like a faulty image on an old television screen. Her face was distorted, her features warped, and her eyes were black, empty voids staring back at him. The beauty he had once known was gone, replaced by something other, something that was both her and not her. She tilted her head, the movement unnaturally slow, almost mechanical. "I've been waiting for you, Ethan," she whispered, her voice soft yet laden with something darker. "Waiting for you to return." He stepped back instinctively, his breath coming in shallow gasps. She reached out with a hand, but it wasn't her hand. It was something cold, something that burned when it touched the air around him. The walls closed in even tighter. He could feel the house's presence now, its ancient, oppressive weight pressing down on him. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. Clara's voice grew louder, more frantic. "You're mine, Ethan. You always were. You always will be." Her figure twisted, the air around her crackling with unnatural energy. A gust of wind blasted through the room, rattling the windows, sending the curtains billowing violently. Shadows swarmed in, stretching toward him, pulling at his limbs, tugging at his very soul. "Clara!" he screamed, his voice breaking in terror. "What are you? What have you become?" But the answer wasn't one he wanted to hear. The walls responded with a deafening roar, the house itself groaning under an unseen force. The ceiling cracked, and the floor beneath his feet splintered. The air grew thicker, heavier, as though the house were alive and hungry. And then it came. A presence. Not Clara. not anything human. It was ancient, primal, and it filled the room with its suffocating energy. Ethan could feel it crawling beneath his skin, curling into his chest, choking the breath from him. The shadows reached for him, pulling him down into the dark. The house swallowed him whole. Chapter 2. The quiet beneath continued. The air around him grew colder still, and Ethan's heart hammered in his chest, as though the very pulse of the house had quickened. The shadows seemed to extend and breathe, like a living thing, curling around his legs, snaking up his spine. He could hear the faintest whispers now, words that seemed to come from all directions, low, guttural voices that churned together in a haunting symphony. Clara, he breathed, his voice trembling. The shadowy figure before him, her face still warped, a twisted imitation of what he had known, tilted its head again. Her eyes, black and empty, drilled into his soul, as if they were searching for something deep inside of him. And perhaps they were. Perhaps for some time now, it wasn't Clara he had been searching for at all. "You came back," she said, her voice, if it could be called that, laced with a mixture of malice and something softer, like an old regret. "But you left me alone. You left me alone in this place." Ethan stepped back, his limbs trembling as though they no longer obeyed him. His mind was in turmoil. He wanted to run, to flee from this nightmare, but his feet felt glued to the floor, his body paralyzed in a cruel game of restraint. There was something pulling him toward her. Or was it the house? His eyes flicked from Clara's twisting form to the walls, which seemed to close in tighter with every passing second. "What are you?" he whispered, half in awe, half in terror. "What happened to you?" Clara smiled, but it wasn't the smile of the woman he had known. Her lips cracked into a smile that was too wide, too jagged, like something carved out of desperation. Her voice came out in a slow, elongated rasp. "Do you remember the promise, Ethan? The promise you made, when you said we would always be together? You swore you'd never leave me, but you broke that vow. You broke me." A ripple of unease rolled through his chest, like a wave that had no end. He wasn't sure what to believe anymore. He wasn't sure if the woman in front of him was Clara at all. The eyes staring back at him, cold and distant, seemed so familiar. But the horror in them. No, it wasn't her. It couldn't be. He clenched his fists, trying to steady himself, but the words kept flowing, each one slipping out of her mouth like an incantation. "You came back because you couldn't forget me, Ethan, but it's too late. Too late for us. Too late for you." Suddenly, the room seemed to implode. The walls that had been steadily closing in on him grew thicker, more oppressive, as though they were closing off all exits. His breath came in short gasps now. The temperature had dropped so much that his teeth began to chatter, and his hands were numb. Still, he couldn't tear his gaze from Clara's twisted figure. The room was alive, pulsing, vibrating with an unseen energy that pressed against him from every direction. A whisper of a laugh came from her, hollow and cruel. "You see, Ethan, there's no escape. You're part of this now. Forever. This place will never let you go. It's waiting for you. We're all waiting for you." The shadows seemed to breathe deeper, thickening as they spiraled toward him. Ethan tried to scream, but no sound came. His throat was dry, constricted, as though the air around him had solidified. It pressed against his skin, suffocating him, and his chest grew tight. He stumbled backward, his legs unsteady, but still, he could not escape the oppressive feeling of being drawn in. Clara reached forward, her hands curling into claws, elongated fingers that seemed to stretch and stretch, growing impossibly long, like they were reaching beyond the bounds of the human form. She reached for him, her nails scraping through the air like the sound of bones snapping. "No," he gasped. "Please, Clara, no." But the word Clara tasted foreign on his tongue. It was like calling out to someone who had never existed, to something that had been consumed by the darkness that surrounded them. And yet, he still reached toward her. His instincts, those same instincts that had been honed in the quiet corners of his memory, drove him forward. "Why are you doing this to me?" he shouted. I never wanted this. I never wanted any of it. Her laugh deepened into a shrill cackle that reverberated off the walls, a sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. You did want this, Ethan. You always have. The darkness was in you long before you came back here, and now it will consume you. In that moment, a surge of terror overtook him. The house itself seemed to lurch forward, as if it were alive, as if it were not just a structure, but a force, an entity that had claimed him. The walls cracked, and the ceiling above them groaned with an eerie, creaking noise. Ethan's mind screamed, but his body could no longer move. He was trapped in this nightmare, in this never-ending cycle of torment. Suddenly, a sharp guttural growl ripped through the silence, a sound unlike anything human, a low vibration that rattled the very bones in his body. The shadowy form of Clara seemed to recoil, her figure flickering, as if something larger, something darker, was moving just behind her. Ethan's eyes widened as the air around him shifted. He felt a presence, something massive and unknowable, pushing against the boundaries of the room. It moved like a wave of pure darkness, a storm of shadows. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't the oppressive stillness of the house. It was something more terrifying. It was the silence of the void, as if everything around him had been erased. For a moment, he dared to believe that the nightmare was over. But then Clara's voice came again, slow and deliberate. You cannot leave, Ethan. You belong to this place now. Her figure reappeared before him, not fully human, not fully a ghost, but something in between. Her features were a grotesque imitation of the woman he once loved. Her smile was wide, too wide, her eyes bottomless pits that seemed to suck him in. The air around him was thick, heavy with something ancient and hungry. You will stay with me, Ethan, Clara whispered. Forever. A coldness settled deep within him, something darker than fear. It was as if the house had grown into him, feeding off his dread, his memories, his regrets. He had come back to this place to face the past, but the past had never truly left. It was alive within him, and now it was pulling him deeper into its web. Ethan's mind reeled, unable to make sense of the horror he was enduring. His heart raced, blood pounding in his ears as the room spun. He felt himself slipping, the ground beneath him falling away into a chasm of blackness. The darkness consumed him, devouring every piece of him until there was nothing left but a cold, hollow shell. The silence once again fell over the room. And then, softly, as if from a great distance, he heard it. The creak of the front door, Chapter 3, echoes in the walls. The room seemed to bend and contort, as if reality itself had twisted into something unnatural. Ethan felt his chest tighten, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The shadows, once contained in the corners, stretched out like sentient beings, lapping at the edges of his vision, pressing in with an insistent, suffocating force. It wasn't the house that was haunted. No, it was him. The house had merely become a reflection of the darkness that resided within him. He could feel it now, that gnawing sense of dread that had followed him his entire life. That shadow, that voice, that memory of Clara. Was it truly Clara? It had always been there, lurking just out of sight, waiting to pull him into the abyss. His mind raced. He had to leave. There had to be a way out. But every instinct screamed at him to stop, to listen. His eyes flicked around the room, landing on the cracked wallpaper, the sagging floorboards, and the dim, flickering light above. It was all so familiar, but at the same time, utterly foreign. The house looked the same, but something had changed. Something had shifted. Ethan's hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob, but before his fingers could touch the cold metal, a voice, a whisper, barely audible, echoed from the farthest corner of the room. You can't leave. His breath caught in his throat. He turned sharply, scanning the room. Nothing. Only the oppressive silence of the house answered him. The whispers, if they had ever truly existed, seemed to retreat into the walls themselves. Clara? He called out, his voice hoarse and brittle. The silence stretched on, stretching like an unbearable ache. His skin crawled, goosebumps rising along his arms. The house, felt alive, its breath shallow and steady, as though it were waiting for something. For him. It was then that he noticed it. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all of it was subtly moving, like the house itself was breathing. The wallpaper peeled back in places, revealing deep cracks in the plaster, and through those cracks, Ethan could feel, something that chilled him to the bone. It was a movement in the darkness behind the walls, shifting and writhing like some unseen creature. He froze, his eyes locked on the space between the cracks, watching the blackness pulse and undulate like a living thing. No, this is all in my head. It's just the house, just the old house. But the voice in his head was weak, and it faded quickly, overtaken by the cold, gnawing terror that had settled deep in his bones. He knew what he was feeling. This wasn't just the house. This wasn't just the shadows. There was something in this place. Something alive. A creaking sound reverberated through the room. The floorboards groaned under the pressure of something massive moving above him, just out of reach. It was an unnatural sound, too slow, too deliberate. A weight pressed down on him, filling him with the strangest sensation of dread. He turned again, his eyes frantically scanning the room, and that's when he saw it. A figure. A silhouette, dark and indistinct, standing just beyond the threshold of the door. The air went still. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching him. Ethan's heart hammered painfully in his chest, his throat tight with fear. His body felt frozen, as if all the blood had drained from his limbs. It was Clara, wasn't it? She had come back. But the woman before him now, this figure, wasn't the Clara he remembered. This thing in front of him was something else. A chill crawled down his spine as the figure tilted its head, slowly, like a predator assessing its prey. The darkness around it seemed to expand, soaking up the light in the room, leaving only the faint outline of its form. There were no eyes, no face, just a blank, hollow space where a human face should have been. "Clara," Ethan croaked again, his voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it stepped forward, each movement slow and deliberate, the floorboards creaking under its weight. It didn't make a sound, yet Ethan could hear the footfalls in his mind, each step echoing in the empty silence. It was as if the air itself had turned dense, suffocating. The presence in the room was heavy, pressing down on him like an invisible hand. He tried to speak, to move, but the words were trapped in his throat, choking him. He tried to take a step backward, but his legs refused to obey. His body felt alien, as though it no longer belonged to him. His pulse quickened, the blood rushing in his ears as the figure drew closer, its form shimmering like an apparition, wavering between the world of the living and something far darker. And then, it spoke. "Do you remember what you did?" The voice was hollow, a deep echoing tone that seemed to reverberate in his bones. It was a voice he knew, but not really. It was a twisted mockery of the voice he had once heard, a voice he had long buried in his mind, a voice that made him feel sick with guilt. I didn't," Ethan began, his voice trembling, but the words caught in his throat. He couldn't breathe. His body was trembling uncontrollably. The figure moved closer, closer still, until it was standing mere inches from him. Its cold breath brushed against his face, and for a brief moment, he could see something behind the blankness, a faint, flickering image of Clara's face, twisted and contorted in agony. "You left me," the figure whispered. "You abandoned me. You forgot me." Ethan staggered back, his heart racing in his chest. His vision blurred, and he felt himself losing grip on the world around him. Was this real? Was it Clara? Or was this something worse? Something more ancient, more malevolent, that had taken root in her image? The figure reached out with long, cold fingers, touching his chest lightly, like a spider's web brushing against skin. The contact sent a shock of cold through him, paralyzing him with its touch. It was the touch of death, of something beyond the mortal coil, and it sank into him like a knife, twisting deeper into his soul. "You can never escape me," the figure said softly, its voice now a whisper of dark promise. I will haunt you. I will be with you. Always. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, vanishing into the darkness like smoke on the wind. Ethan stood frozen, his body trembling violently. His mind was reeling, spinning with questions he could not answer. He had come back to this place seeking closure, seeking redemption, but all he had found was torment. And whatever he had seen, whatever he had felt, he knew that it wasn't over. It was just beginning. He couldn't escape. Not from the house, not from Clara, not from himself. The walls whispered. The darkness pressed in, and somewhere, deep within the very bones of the house, a heartbeat thrummed. The house had waited for him. It had called to him, and now it had him. Chapter 4. The Unseen Path. The house seemed to breathe around Ethan. Each creak of the wooden floorboards, each rustle of the wind through the decaying walls, felt like the house was alive and watching him. The air was thick with something heavy, something ancient, as if it had witnessed centuries of suffering and torment. It wasn't just the place. It was the darkness. It clung to him like an old tattered coat, wrapping around him, seeping into his skin, into his thoughts. As Ethan stumbled through the dimly lit hallways, the floor beneath his feet groaning with each step, the whispering shadows seemed to move with him. It wasn't just a trick of the light. He could feel them shifting, bending, coiling like living things, following him, waiting for him to make a mistake. The house wasn't simply a prison. It was a predator, and he was its prey. He had to find a way out. He had to escape, but he didn't know how. Each door he opened led to another room just like the one he'd left behind, cluttered, decaying, suffocating with the same heavy air, and always the whispers followed. Low, guttural, unintelligible words, scraping against his nerves like nails on a chalkboard. Clara, he whispered, his voice raw, cracked. He needed to find her, to understand what had happened, to understand what had changed. But something told him that even if he did find her, it wouldn't be her anymore. Not really. He could still see her face, that last moment of agony before the darkness had claimed her. Her eyes, wide and hollow, her mouth stretched into a scream that had never left his mind. He tried to shut it out, but the memory was sharp, cutting through him like a knife. He rounded a corner, and for the briefest moment, the air felt different. It wasn't as stifling. It wasn't as alive. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he saw it. A door. It was at the end of the hallway, hidden behind a veil of darkness. Unlike the other doors, which were weathered, chipped, and decayed, this one looked pristine. The wood was smooth and dark, unmarred by time or neglect. The brass doorknob gleamed faintly in the dim light, almost too perfect to be real. Without thinking, Ethan reached for it. His hand hovered over the knob, and for a moment, his mind screamed at him to stop. There was something about the door, something wrong. But curiosity, that cursed thing, drove him forward. He twisted the knob, and the door creaked open. What lay beyond was nothing like the rest of the house. A long corridor stretched out before him, its walls lined with old portraits, paintings of people whose eyes seemed to follow him, whose expressions twisted into grimaces the longer he stared. They were all staring at him, unblinking, silent, but there was something unsettling about the way their gazes seemed too alive, too aware. Ethan stepped forward, his footfalls silent on the thick red carpet that ran the length of the hall. It smelled musty here, like the old books he used to read in his childhood. Dusty, forgotten, but there was something else too, something faintly metallic. His heart began to race, and his hands trembled as he gripped the edges of the doorframe. The paintings were getting closer, their eyes narrowing in judgment. The air felt heavier, and the shadows seemed to creep closer to him, pressing in, suffocating him. Ethan's pulse quickened as the whispers, which had faded slightly, began to return, louder now, more urgent, like voices from behind closed doors, speaking words that made no sense. But then, amidst the cacophony, there was something clearer. A name. Ethan. The voice was low but familiar, tinged with desperation. It was Clara's voice. He knew it instantly. But it wasn't the Clara he remembered. It wasn't the Clara who had loved him. The Clara who had lived. No, this voice was hollow. It was broken. His chest tightened. And he found himself walking down the hallway, his legs moving of their own accord. Each step felt like it was not his own, like the house was pulling him forward, forcing him into the depths of its heart. "Clara?" he breathed again. But this time, the air around him seemed to shudder, as though the very walls of the house were holding their breath. The portraits grew more twisted the further he walked, their faces contorted into grotesque expressions, their eyes now wide with malice. The hall seemed to stretch on forever, and as Ethan walked deeper into the darkness, the air became colder. The whispers became clearer, more frantic, until they were all around him, surrounding him like a swarm of insects. "Ethan, come closer." The voice was closer now. He could feel it. It was coming from just beyond the next door at the end of the hall. But something was wrong. Something in his gut twisted, warning him to stop. He knew that voice. He remembered that voice. But now it was suffused with something darker. Something that gnawed at him, that pulled at his very soul. Ethan reached the door, his hand cold as he gripped the brass knob. The whispers were louder now, desperate, pleading, but there was no comfort in them, only dread. He opened the door. The room beyond was dark, save for a single light flickering in the far corner, casting long shadows across the floor. There, in the center of the room, was a figure, Clara. But she wasn't the Clara he remembered. Her once beautiful features were now twisted, disfigured by something dark and ancient. Her eyes were hollow, sunken deep into her skull, and her mouth was stretched into a grotesque smile, her teeth sharp and jagged like the fangs of a predator. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice now a low, guttural rasp that sent a chill through his spine. "I've been waiting for you." Ethan took a step back, his body frozen in terror. His mind screamed at him to leave, to turn and run, but his feet were glued to the floor. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. Clara's form began to move, the shadows around her shifting unnaturally. She took a slow step toward him, her movements jerky and wrong, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. The room seemed to warp around her, as if the very space itself was bending, twisting to her will. "You can't escape me," she hissed. "You can never escape what you've done." Ethan's breath hitched as the walls seemed to close in around him. His heart pounded in his chest, his vision blurring. He didn't know what she meant. What had he done? But the question barely registered before the room grew colder, darker, and the shadows pressed in closer. Clara was no longer standing before him. Instead, her form was stretching, shifting into something far darker, far more sinister. It was no longer her. It was something else. Something much older, something far more malevolent. The house had claimed her, twisted her into its servant, and now it wanted him. "You're mine," it whispered. And the last thing Ethan saw before the darkness took him was Clara's face, or what had once been Clara's face, twisted into a monstrous grin. Chapter 4. The Unseen Path. Continued. The darkness swallowed him whole. Ethan's body felt weightless, as though he were floating in an endless void. Time had no meaning here. Seconds stretched into eternity, and his thoughts dissolved into the black. The faint sound of his own breath was the only tether he had to the waking world, but even that seemed to grow quieter, fainter. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the silence shattered. A loud metallic screech tore through the air, reverberating in his skull. Ethan's eyes snapped open, his heart pounding violently against his ribs. The room had shifted again. The walls were closer now, pressing inward, their surfaces undulating like they were alive. Faint symbols, ones he couldn't understand but instinctively feared, glowed dimly along the cracks in the plaster. The whispers returned, rising from the corners of the room like smoke, curling around his ears in a chorus of despair. "Ethan." That voice, it was unmistakable. Clara. But the sound of her name now filled him with dread. not relief. It was her. And yet it wasn't. The warmth he had once known was gone, replaced by something cold, alien, and predatory. "Why are you doing this?" he whispered hoarsely, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear. No response. The air thickened, the room pulsating like a living organism. Ethan staggered backward, his knees buckling beneath him. His head swiveled frantically, searching for the source of the voice, but the shadows refused to give up their secrets. Then he felt it, a hand on his shoulder. Cold, icy, inhuman. He spun around, but there was no one there, just the empty air, thick with the oppressive presence of something unseen. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the warped walls. "Clara, whatever this is, whatever you're trying to do, stop." The only answer was laughter, hollow, distant, and layered, as though it came from 100 mouths all at once. He stumbled toward the door, desperate to escape the suffocating confines of the room. His fingers gripped the doorknob, but the metal burned his palm, forcing him to let go with a yelp. He stared at his hand, red and blistered, the pain sharp and unforgiving. "You can't leave!" The voice came from behind him, closer now, no longer distant, slowly, reluctantly. Ethan turned. Clara stood there, or what was left of her. Her figure was translucent, flickering in and out like a faulty signal on an old television. Her hair, once so vibrant, hung in limp strands around her face. Her skin was grey, stretched taut over her hollow cheeks. And her eyes were voids, black and endless, pulling him in. "Clara," he whispered, his voice trembling. She took a step forward, her movements unnatural, jerky, like a marionette manipulated by unseen hands. The shadows around her seemed to writhe and pulse, as though they were alive, feeding off her presence. "You came back," she said, her voice layered with a strange duality. Hers and something else. "You couldn't stay away, could you?" Ethan's breath hitched, his throat dry and constricted. I didn't know. I didn't mean for this to happen. She cut him off with a sharp laugh, her head tilting at an unnatural angle. "But you did mean it, Ethan. You left me here. You left me to this." Her voice broke, a raw, guttural sound that made his stomach twist. "And now you think you can just walk away?" The room began to spin, the walls warping, bending inward. Ethan staggered, clutching at his chest as his heart raced. He could feel it. The house itself was alive, feeding on his fear, his guilt. "I didn't mean to leave you," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't know, Clara. I didn't know this would happen to you." Her smile twisted into something grotesque, her teeth sharp and jagged, glinting in the dim light. "You didn't know," she hissed. "You knew. You always knew." The shadows lunged. They wrapped around him like cold, wet hands, pulling him to the ground. He struggled, thrashing against the unseen force, but it was too strong. The darkness pressed against his skin, seeping into his pores, choking him. "You belong here, Ethan," Clara said, her voice calm now, almost tender. She knelt beside him, her cold fingers brushing against his cheek. "This is where you were always meant to be, with me." "No!" he screamed, his voice raw and desperate. "This isn't real. This can't be real." Clara's face twisted in rage, her form flickering violently. "You can't escape me, Ethan. You are me. You always have been." Her words struck him like a blow, the truth in them undeniable. This wasn't just about her. This wasn't just about the house. This was about him. The darkness, the guilt, the fear. It had always been inside him, festering, growing, waiting for the moment to consume him. And now it had. The shadows tightened their grip, pulling him deeper into the floor, into the house, into the void. Clara's laughter echoed around him, a haunting, endless sound that followed him as he fell. Chapter 5. The house's breath. The air in the room thickened. It was no longer just the silence that suffocated Ethan. It was the weight of something ancient, something that had lived in this house far longer than any of them. The air tasted sour, like decay, like something forgotten, left to rot in the dark corners of time. Ethan tried to take a breath, but the stale air seemed to press against his lungs, suffocating him from within. The shadows clung to the walls like wet cloth, their edges jagged and alive, twisting and curling as if they were creatures of their own design. The house itself, Ethan now realized, was more than a mere building. It was a living, breathing thing, and its hunger stretched far beyond the physical. A low rumble came from beneath his feet, like the groan of something stirring deep within the earth. The floors creaked, the walls shuddered, and then there was a sound like a sigh, the sigh of the house. Ethan's legs buckled, and he collapsed onto the floor. His body trembled, as though every nerve in his body was on fire. He felt something sharp against his skin, the touch of cold fingers skittering along his neck. He jerked his head back, but no one was there. Clara! His voice cracked, barely above a whisper. Her name felt like an incantation now, a chant that could summon both salvation and doom. He had seen the glimpses of her face, pale, twisted, filled with an unearthly rage. But what was she now? Was she still Clara, or had she become something else entirely? His eyes darted around the room, but there was nothing in the flickering light to suggest a way out. Only shadows, only the unshakable presence of the house, closing in around him, smothering him. Then he saw it. A figure, standing still, a silhouette against the dim light. A woman, a ghost, Clara. She stood in the corner of the room, watching him with hollow eyes. Her form was translucent, flickering like a dying flame. Her lips parted, but no sound came from them. She didn't need to speak. Ethan felt her presence suffuse the room, filling every corner, pressing against his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. Clara, please, he whispered, his voice trembling. What do you want from me? The room grew colder. The temperature dropped, and Ethan could see his breath in front of him. He shivered uncontrollably, the chill seeping deep into his bones. The floor beneath him felt as though it were pulling him down, as if the very ground wanted to consume him. He tried to move, to push himself away from the floor, but his body refused to obey. It felt as though the shadows had a hold of him now, locking him in place. Clara's eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, never left him. Slowly she lifted a hand toward him, her fingers stretched out like claws. As she did, the shadows around her seemed to stretch and twist, reaching out as though they had a life of their own. Ethan! Her voice came, distant, yet impossibly close. You belong to me now. You have always belonged to me. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. What? What are you saying? But Clara's lips curled into a grin, an unsettling wide grin. You think you can escape? You think you can run from me? From this place? This is your home, Ethan. This is where you've always been meant to be. The shadows around her grew denser, darker, until they became one with her form. She wasn't just Clara anymore. She was something else, something far more ancient. She was the house itself. His head spun, the walls around him closing in as his pulse thundered in his ears. The room was suffocating, a tomb, and it felt as though the walls were narrowing with every passing second. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps. No, no, this can't be real. You're not real. Clara's laughter was soft at first, then it grew louder, a chilling sound that rattled his very soul. Oh, Ethan, you're so much like me. You don't understand, do you? You don't know what you're walking into. The shadows began to shift, curling around him, suffocating him, and yet they also called to him. Their whispers grew louder, voices layered upon voices, like 1,000 souls crying out in torment. Please, just let me go, Ethan begged, his voice cracking. Clara's figure flickered again. She was closer now, standing just in front of him, her fingers inches away from his skin. He could feel the cold emanating from her, an ice-cold sensation that made his blood run cold. Her touch would burn, he knew it, not with heat, but with something much worse. With a flick of her wrist, the shadows surged forward. Ethan tried to scream, but the air was gone, taken by the darkness. His mouth was sealed shut as if by an invisible force. His body trembled, his limbs frozen in place. He couldn't move, couldn't escape. "Ethan," Clara whispered again, but this time her voice was no longer hers. It was deeper, guttural, twisted. "You are a part of this place now, forever." And then the house seemed to breathe. The floor creaked beneath him. The walls groaned. The very air seemed to pulse in rhythm with the house's heartbeat. He could feel the house's will, its insatiable hunger for him. He didn't know how much longer he could stand it. The shadows closed in tighter, wrapping around him like a cocoon, suffocating him, pulling him deeper. The last thing he saw was Clara's face, her wide, cruel grin, her eyes hollow and black, devouring him. And then, nothing. The sound stopped. The air was still. The weight that had settled over the room, pressing in on him, was gone. When Ethan opened his eyes again, he was no longer in the room with Clara. He was in the hallway. But something was wrong. The walls, once a sickly yellow, were now dark, streaked with black veins that pulsed as if they were alive. The floor beneath him was slick with something wet, sticky. His hands were trembling as he pushed himself off the ground. But as he stood, he realized the hallway stretched endlessly before him, twisting in ways that defied logic. The house seemed to shift, morphing before his eyes. He tried to scream, but no sound came from his mouth. His throat was dry, choked, as if something was squeezing the very life from him. And then he heard it, the soft, familiar whisper, "Ethan, come to me." His body moved before his mind could react. Step by step, he found himself walking toward the sound, each footfall heavier than the last. The darkness was alive, guiding him, pulling him deeper into the heart of the house, deeper into the place that was no longer a home. It was something worse, something far worse. Chapter 6. The Walls Whisper. The house, it seemed, had forgotten its boundaries. Ethan no longer knew where he was. Every step he took, the hallway stretched further, twisting, as if the walls themselves were conspiring against him. The shadows, no longer simply part of the dark corners, were alive, slithering along the surfaces. They rippled like liquid, pooling at his feet, before slithering up the walls to merge with the ceiling. The air was thick, saturated with the stench of decay, of rot that gnawed at his senses. Each breath he took tasted bitter, like iron and earth. "Clara, where are you?" Ethan whispered, his voice barely a murmur amidst the oppressive silence. But no answer came, only the steady, haunting creaks of the house itself, as though it had developed a life of its own. His footfalls echoed through the empty hallway, but they too seemed unnatural, stretching in time like an endless cacophony. The walls were no longer solid, no longer real. There were faces in them, faces that watched him, that pressed against the fabric of the house, their eyes wide and frantic, their mouths stretched in silent screams. The faces were trapped, etched into the wood, the plaster, the very bones of the house. Ethan could feel their eyes on him, hot and suffocating, and he wished he could look away. But he couldn't. Something inside him compelled him to move forward, to keep walking down the long corridor, the walls closing in with each step. There was a sense of inevitability in the air, a feeling that the house had already claimed him, that there was no turning back. A sudden sound broke the stillness, a low, guttural growl, like something awakening from a long slumber. Ethan froze, his body rigid, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. He turned slowly, searching the shadows for the source of the noise, but saw nothing. The growl came again, louder this time, more insistent. It rumbled through the walls, vibrating the very air around him. It was as though the house itself was alive, its heartbeat reverberating through the floorboards and into his bones. He stumbled back, tripping over his own feet as his mind scrambled to make sense of what was happening. His hands clutched at the walls for balance, but as his fingers brushed the rough, cold surface, he felt something that shouldn't have been there. Something warm and wet, slick like blood, coating the edges of the wall where his hands had touched. Panic surged within him, his heart hammering in his chest. He tore his hand away, looking at it in the dim light, His fingers were stained red, but the blood wasn't his. It was fresh, thick, almost alive in the way it clung to his skin. The growl came again, but this time it wasn't just from the walls. It was from everywhere, from beneath the floor, from above, from within the very fabric of the house itself, and it was getting louder, more insistent, like the growl of a creature waking from a long and disturbed sleep. The lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that crawled across the floor and up the walls. Ethan's breath quickened, and his stomach churned. The temperature in the house plummeted, his skin breaking out in cold, clammy sweat as the dark corners of the room seemed to press in closer, suffocating him. In the distance, the sound of something scraping against the walls began. It was slow at first, methodical, as though something was dragging itself across the floor, its claws scraping against the wood, leaving deep gouges in the planks. Ethan wanted to run. He needed to get out, to leave, to escape this house, this nightmare. But his body refused to cooperate. The whispering began. It was faint at first, a low murmur that seemed to come from everywhere, from the walls, from the floor, from the very air around him. It was like 1,000 voices speaking all at once, their words unintelligible, their tones foreign and guttural. They whispered his name, Ethan, over and over, until the sound was so insistent that his mind began to unravel. Ethan, come closer. The voice that spoke was different from the others, familiar, yet distorted. It was Clara's voice, or at least it sounded like her voice, but it was wrong. It was hollow, empty, like it had been stripped of its humanity. Ethan's blood ran cold as the floor beneath him shifted, groaning in protest. The house seemed to tremble with an invisible force, and he could feel it. The pull, the weight, the slow, steady tug toward the source of the voice. Clara, is that you? Ethan choked, his throat tightening. There was no answer, only the whisper of the wind through the cracked windows and the soft rhythmic sound of something dragging itself along the hallway floor. He wanted to scream, to flee, but his legs felt like lead, unwilling to carry him. Suddenly, a shadow darted out from the corner of his vision, a fleeting movement that seemed to vanish as quickly as it appeared. His heart leapt in his chest. Something was out there, something that was waiting for him. Ethan's hand shot out, grabbing the first door he could find. It creaked open with a sound that made his teeth ache, revealing a small, dimly lit room. There were no windows, no way out, just the flickering light from a single candle resting on a wooden table. He stumbled inside, his mind racing as he searched for some sign of Clara, some explanation for what was happening to him. The walls of the room were covered in strange, ancient symbols, painted in a dark, crimson red that seemed to pulse with life. The air inside was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew and blood. Ethan gagged, his throat tightening as he struggled to steady his breathing. At the far end of the room, a mirror stood. It was tall, framed in dark wood, its surface cloudy with age. Ethan's reflection stared back at him, but something was wrong. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, as though he hadn't slept in days, weeks, maybe even longer. He reached toward the mirror, his hand trembling, as if the reflection was pulling him in. Clara. His voice was barely a whisper, then he saw it. The reflection wasn't just him, it was Clara. She was standing behind him, her pale hands resting on his shoulders. Her mouth stretched into a grin, wide and twisted, her eyes black voids that seemed to swallow the light. No, Ethan gasped, stumbling back from the mirror, his heart racing. You're not real. But the reflection didn't move. It stayed there, staring back at him. Clara's twisted form pressed against his own. Her smile grew, stretching impossibly wide until her face was a grotesque mask of madness. And then, in a voice that echoed through the room, she spoke. You're mine, Ethan. Forever. The room seemed to warp, the walls bending inward as though the house itself was breathing in time with her voice. The mirror rippled like water, distorting her face. But still, her voice came, chilling, haunting, relentless. You've always been mine. Ethan stumbled back, desperate to escape. But there was no door, no way out. The shadows closed in around him, pulling him toward the mirror, toward Clara, toward the house that was no longer a home, but something far darker, something alive. And then, with a final desperate scream, Ethan was consumed by the darkness. Chapter 7. The echo of a forgotten heart. The world outside had grown strangely quiet. The wind no longer whispered through the trees, and the moon had become a distant, cold eye that watched from above, but did not care to intervene. The house, though, was alive. The pulse of the old wood and the deep creaks of its shifting timbers were louder than ever, as though the building itself was still breathing, still alive. But this was not the life of the house Ethan had once known. This was something darker, something twisted. Ethan woke with a start, gasping for air as though he had been submerged in cold water. His eyes snapped open, but the room before him was not familiar. It was like he had been transported to a place between the living and the dead, a place where time had no meaning, and reality twisted like a reflection in a broken mirror. The walls were no longer solid. They breathed, pulsing gently, as though they were part of the same nightmare. Ethan could feel the pressure of the air around him, thick and heavy. His skin crawled, a sensation that seemed to crawl beneath his flesh. Every breath he took seemed to carry a taste of something sour, something metallic. There was no light here, no warmth, only shadows that clung to every surface, twisting and writhing as if they had a life of their own. He could hear them, low murmurs, like whispers in a forgotten language, echoing from the far corners of the room. The house was speaking to him again. He stood up, his body trembling, his mind clouded. Where was Clara? Was she still here, trapped somewhere in this forsaken place? Or had she already become part of the house, a part of the madness that consumed everything in its path? Ethan's legs felt weak beneath him, his feet unsteady as they dragged him toward the door. It was still there, an old wooden door that had once led to the rest of the house. But now it was different. The wood was warped, and the handle seemed to pulse with the same eerie rhythm as the walls, as if it was alive. He reached for it with a trembling hand, the cold metal of the handle biting into his skin as his fingers closed around it. A chill ran down his spine. His mind screamed at him to stop, to turn away and forget this place, this nightmare. But his body moved of its own accord, as though some unseen force was pushing him forward. The door creaked open with a sound that sent a shiver through his entire being, the noise ringing in the stillness like the groan of a dying animal. Beyond it, the hallway stretched out before him, long and dark. But something was different. The air was thick, almost suffocating, with a strange, acrid smell that burned his nostrils. The walls, once familiar, now seemed alien, covered in strange markings that wriggled beneath his gaze, shifting and changing like living things. Something was watching him from the darkness. Ethan could feel it, like a presence lurking just out of sight, waiting for him to make the first move. His heart beat faster, the rhythm quickening as he moved down the hallway, drawn forward by the same strange force that had pulled him from the safety of his bed. The whispers grew louder. They were no longer words, but sounds, unintelligible, like the low hum of 1,000 voices, their meaning lost in the overwhelming noise. But there was a pattern to it, a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with his own heartbeat. "Clara," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible in the thick air. "Where are you?" The hallway stretched on forever, its end swallowed by the darkness. But as Ethan continued walking, he began to see faint shapes moving in the shadows, too quick to catch, too elusive to hold on to. Faces, pale and twisted, flashed in the darkness like fleeting memories. Eyes wide and empty, mouths frozen in silent screams. He reached a door, one he didn't recognize. It was different from the others. This one was made of black iron, its surface smooth but cold to the touch, like the chill of the grave. The whispers grew louder now, more insistent. They were not coming from the walls or the shadows, but from behind the door. Ethan reached for the handle, his hand shaking. He paused for a moment, his heart racing. The door seemed to beckon him, its very presence drawing him in. He could hear Clara's voice, faint and broken, calling to him from the other side. "Help me, Ethan. Please." Her voice was unmistakable, filled with the same desperation that had driven him to find her all those months ago. It was a voice that had once filled his heart with love, with warmth, with hope. But now, it felt hollow, distant, like an echo of a memory long since forgotten. With trembling hands, he opened the door. The room beyond was bathed in a sickly dim light, its walls lined with strange symbols that seemed to pulse with life, like veins beneath the skin. In the center of the room stood a mirror, its surface covered in frost. The air around it was thick with a sense of foreboding, as if it was a gateway to something far darker than anything Ethan had encountered before. He stepped inside, his feet crunching on the floor as he moved closer to the mirror. The glass was cold to the touch, sending a jolt of ice through his fingers. And then he saw it, a figure standing on the other side of the mirror. It was Clara, or at least it looked like her. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and dark, her lips twisted in a grin that made Ethan's stomach churn. But it wasn't her. It couldn't be. The reflection was wrong, twisted, like a broken piece of glass that had been pieced together again, but in the wrong way. "Clara," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking in the stillness. "Is that really you?" The figure in the mirror did not answer. Instead, it stepped closer to the glass, pressing its hands against it, the cold surface fogging with each touch. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the figure's face twisted into something unrecognizable, something monstrous. And then, with a sudden jolt, the reflection cracked. The glass splintered, the cracks spreading like spiderwebs across the surface. Ethan staggered back, his heart pounding in his chest as the room seemed to collapse around him. The walls groaned, and the floor trembled beneath his feet. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that filled his head, drowning out everything else. He turned, frantic, looking for a way out, but the door he had entered through was gone. There was no escape. Only the mirror, now shattered, its pieces scattered across the floor like shards of a broken soul. Ethan fell to his knees, his hands trembling as they touched the cold glass. The shards seemed to pulse with a strange energy, a dark force that tugged at him, pulling him toward the center of the room. He could feel something inside him shift, a part of himself that he had long since buried, beginning to awaken. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "This isn't real." But the voices, the whispers, they would not stop. They were everywhere now, inside him, around him, twisting, pulling, consuming. His mind was unraveling, and he could feel it. He was no longer in control. He was becoming a part of this place, a part of whatever nightmare had taken hold of him. The mirror shattered completely, its pieces falling like raindrops to the floor. And in the reflection of the broken glass, Ethan saw it. The truth. Chapter 7. The Echo of a Forgotten Heart. Continued. The glass shards settled on the floor, their jagged edges gleaming faintly in the dim light that seemed to pulse from nowhere, as if the darkness itself was alive and breathing. Ethan stared at the broken pieces scattered before him, each fragment reflecting a distorted version of himself, warped, twisted, like a reflection of someone who no longer belonged in the world. The whispers were louder now, rising like a storm, crashing against his ears. They came not from the shadows, nor from the walls, but from within. 1,000 voices, each one clawing at his mind, each one demanding something he couldn't understand. Something was shifting inside of him. He could feel it, like the gnawing of hunger in the pit of his stomach. But it was deeper, more insidious, more profound. Ethan's hands shook as he reached for the scattered glass. The shards glinted in the weak light, sharp and unforgiving. He knew it was a mistake, that touching them would pull him deeper into whatever nightmare this place had become. But he couldn't stop himself. He had to know. He had to understand. His fingers grazed the edge of the glass, and a sudden, overwhelming sensation of cold rushed through him. The room seemed to tilt, like he was falling sideways into another dimension. The air thickened. The temperature dropped. His breath became visible, hanging in front of him in fragile clouds that dissipated almost immediately, swallowed by the growing darkness. And then he heard it. The voice. Clara's voice. Faint at first, like a whisper on the wind, but unmistakable. "Help me, Ethan." It was her. Or at least it sounded like her. But the voice had changed, now layered with something darker, something more desperate. A low, guttural sob echoed behind the words, as if the pain in her voice was not her own. The sound of a soul breaking. Ethan's heart raced. He stumbled forward, his hands scrabbling against the floor, desperately trying to gather the pieces of glass. But the shards had stopped reflecting his own image. Now they showed something else. In one, there was a flicker of Clara, or a figure that looked like her. She was standing in a room, the walls around her cracked, the floor covered in dust and debris. Her eyes were hollow, her face pale and thin, but it was the expression on her face that caught Ethan's breath, terror mixed with sorrow, as if she had been waiting for something, or someone, for far too long. The reflection trembled, distorted, and then cracked again, like glass breaking under pressure. In the next shard, a new image appeared. It was no longer Clara. It was something else. A figure dressed in black, tall and shadowed, with hollow eyes staring out from a face obscured by the darkness. The figure moved, its steps too fluid, too unnatural. Ethan felt his pulse quicken, his chest tightening. This was wrong. All of it. The house, the shadows, the whispers. It was as if something ancient had stirred beneath the floorboards, something that had been waiting for him, for this moment, waiting to drag him into the void. No, Ethan muttered to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. He could barely form coherent thoughts, the horror of it all choking him. This can't be happening. This isn't real. But the mirror told him otherwise. The broken glass shattered further, pieces spiraling into the air, twisting like knives around him. The shadows in the room lengthened, darkening the edges of his vision. He could feel them, feel the presence of something ancient and hungry, something that had been waiting for this very moment. The door to the room, the one he had entered through, had vanished, replaced with a wall of blackness, an impenetrable void. The air around him thickened, like the atmosphere before a storm, and with each breath, the pressure mounted, like the world itself was closing in on him. The whispers grew into a cacophony, drowning out everything else, until there was only the sound of the voices, 1,000, no more, rising in a chorus of agony and rage. Ethan! It was Clara's voice again. But now it didn't sound like her at all. It was twisted, like the last breath of someone dying in the depths of despair. Ethan, come back. Come back to me. He looked up, his eyes searching the room, the shadows, the ceiling, the floor. There was no escape. It was like being trapped inside a coffin, surrounded by whispers, by shadows, by the cold touch of death itself. A sudden gust of wind blew through the room, though the walls had no windows. The door was still gone, and the cold was unbearable. Ethan felt it tear through him, like ice creeping into his veins. His breath came out in short, frantic bursts. Something was watching him. The air shifted again. In the corner of the room, beneath the shadows, something moved. Something large. Ethan turned slowly, his eyes wide with dread. He could feel it. The presence of the thing moving just beyond the edge of his vision, its shape barely perceptible in the flickering shadows. But then, it was there, standing right in front of him. It was Clara. Or no, it was not Clara. This thing, this shadow, had her shape but was wrong, twisted in ways that made Ethan's skin crawl. Her eyes were wide, too wide, black as night. Her mouth was stretched into an eerie smile that did not belong to her. The figure reached out to him, and as it did, a flood of memories hit him. Memories of their time together, of Clara before all of this started, the way her laugh used to echo through the halls, the warmth of her touch, the love they shared. But now it was all twisted, all distorted. No, Ethan breathed. Clara, this isn't you. What happened to you? The figure's smile deepened, its face stretching unnaturally. Then it spoke. You wanted me, Ethan, it whispered, its voice a hollow echo of the woman he once loved. Now you have me. The room shifted again. The walls, the shadows, the air. It all bent and warped, pulling him toward the thing in front of him. It was no longer a room, no longer the house. It was something worse, a void that stretched out forever, a place without hope. And then, as Ethan struggled to break free, as his mind screamed to wake from this nightmare, the figure lunged at him, its hands gripping his throat, cold as death. Chapter 8. The Shifting Silence. The silence that descended after Clara's disappearance was like the calm before a storm, a silence that pressed against Ethan's chest, heavier than the darkened weight of the house itself. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere was bending around him. The whispers, the wailing cries of those long gone, had stopped, leaving only a deep, bone-chilling quiet that reverberated within his skull. Ethan's hands trembled as he reached out, grasping the cold doorknob that seemed to mock him in its immovable stillness. The door, a thick wooden barrier that had once separated him from the truth, now stood wide open. There was no longer any threshold between him and the world beyond. Only the unsettling darkness stretched out before him, like a ravenous mouth ready to swallow him whole. "Clara?" His voice cracked under the weight of the question. It felt as though he had asked it too many times, each time sinking deeper into the abyss. The name lingered in the air, hollow and desperate. He stepped forward, his feet sinking slightly into the floor, as though the house itself were absorbing him. Each step felt like a choice, as if he was walking toward an inevitable end. But what end? What fate awaited him in this place? Was this truly his punishment for the sins he had forgotten? Or had he unwittingly walked into a dimension where time and reality bled together, indistinguishable from the horrors of the past? The hallway stretched before him, its walls adorned with faded wallpaper that curled at the edges like rotting skin. The candlelight flickered erratically, casting long, trembling shadows that danced along the walls. Ethan could feel the weight of those shadows, as though they were watching him, waiting for him to make the wrong move. There was no way to tell if they were real or a figment of his mind unraveling. He reached the end of the hallway and stopped in front of a door he did not recognize. The door was old, so old that it seemed to have grown into the structure of the house itself, a piece of the wall rather than a separate entrance. A peculiar coldness radiated from it, a strange, unnatural cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. His hand hovered over the doorknob, hesitant. He was paralyzed with fear, but also with an unrelenting need to understand what lay beyond. There was something compelling about the door, something he could not explain. The wood beneath his fingers felt alive, warm despite the cold air. The darkness behind it was not empty. He could feel something lurking just on the other side, something that was aware of him. "Clara!" His voice was barely more than a breath, but it was enough to make the air around him hum with tension. There was a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle, almost imperceptible change, as though something had heard him. Something had been waiting for him to speak her name. The doorknob clicked open of its own accord. The room beyond was dark, too dark to make out anything at first. A foul stench hit him, sharp and acrid like the smell of decay. He took a tentative step forward, his senses overwhelmed by the oppressive atmosphere. It was as if the room itself were alive, breathing, waiting, watching. The floor creaked beneath his feet, each sound magnified in the stillness, as if his very presence disturbed the forgotten world within this room. The air around him thickened, becoming heavier with each passing second. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the door creaked open wider, revealing a shape in the center of the room. It was Clara, or at least, it looked like her. Her figure stood motionless, her back to him. Her hair hung limp, her skin pale as if drained of life. Her hands were outstretched, palms facing the floor, as though she were waiting for something, or someone, to come to her. The shadows around her twisted, coiling like serpents, reaching for her outstretched hands. The deeper he looked into her form, the more wrong it felt. Her body was contorted, impossibly thin, as if stretched too far. Her neck craned back at an unnatural angle, her face hidden in the dark strands of her hair. But it was the way she moved, or rather, didn't move, that unsettled him. Ethan called her name again, but the words stuck in his throat. He could feel his voice trembling, not just from fear but from something else, something primal, something that told him not to approach. But his legs were already carrying him forward, each step drawing him closer to the figure in the dark. A voice, low and raspy, echoed from the shadows. It was not Clara's. It was something else, something ancient and cruel. "She is not here," the voice whispered. "You never wanted her. You never loved her." The words hung in the air, reverberating around him like an echo. Ethan stopped in his tracks, his heart beating wildly, as the voice seemed to come from all directions at once, swirling around him like smoke. "You wanted this," the voice continued. "You summoned this. You brought her here. And now she belongs to me." A surge of cold enveloped Ethan's body, freezing him in place. He tried to move, to escape, but his feet were rooted to the floor, as though the house itself had claimed him, binding him to this moment. His pulse quickened as the figure before him began to twitch, spasming as though it was alive, yet not. Then, Clara's head turned sharply, too quickly, and her eyes locked onto his. There was no recognition in them, only a hollow, vacant stare, as if the person he once loved had been replaced by something far darker. Her lips parted, but instead of words, a low, guttural growl emerged, a sound that was neither human nor animal. It was a sound born from something deep within the earth, from the dark recesses of the universe itself. Ethan wanted to scream, but his voice was choked, stifled by the sheer terror that gripped him. His mind was unraveling, the edges of reality beginning to warp and bend. He couldn't escape. He couldn't wake up. The room was closing in on him, the shadows pressing tighter around him, suffocating him. And then, just as he thought he might lose himself entirely to the madness, the room went still, completely still. For a moment, there was no sound, no movement, nothing but the heavy silence pressing against him, like the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. His heart was a drumbeat in the dark. His breath was the only thing moving, shallow and ragged. Clara, or whatever had taken her place, was gone. The room was empty once more, but the shadows remained. The darkness lingered, hanging in the air like a promise unfulfilled. Ethan's hands trembled as he tried to steady himself, but he felt it then. Something had changed. Something had broken. His reality was slipping, like sand through his fingers, and there was no telling if he would ever find solid ground again. "Clara?" he whispered one last time, though his voice had lost all strength. The answer came in the form of a laugh, a dry, crackling sound that echoed in his skull, sending waves of cold dread rippling through him. And then, nothing. Chapter 9. The echoes of what's left behind. The air was colder now, as if the world itself was exhaling in sorrow. Ethan stood in the middle of the room, his hands slick with sweat, his heart pounding as though trying to break free from his chest. His vision blurred, the edges of his world twisting like an ancient photograph left to decay. Time no longer moved in linear fashion here. It pulsed, unevenly, distorting his perception of reality. His mind recoiled in disbelief at what had just happened. Clara, or what had once been Clara, had disappeared in the blink of an eye, leaving behind nothing but the oppressive silence and the fading scent of decay. He could still feel her presence, though, lingering in the shadows, in the corners of his vision, creeping around the edges of his thoughts. The house wasn't done with him. He could feel its grip tightening. Ethan's legs felt heavy as he turned back toward the door, a hollow ache settling in his bones. He couldn't stay here. Every part of him screamed to run, to flee. But something, some dark force, pulled him back toward the center of the room, toward the empty space where Clara's twisted figure had stood just moments ago. He felt as though he were being drawn deeper into the house's web, every instinct telling him to leave, yet his feet remained frozen in place. "You brought her here," the voice echoed again, hollow and guttural, the sound reverberating through the air like the cry of some ancient, tortured thing. "She is mine now." Ethan's breath caught in his throat as his eyes darted to the corners of the room. The shadows, thick and oppressive, seemed to stir with a life of their own. The walls, once solid and immovable, now seemed to shift with the pulse of something unseen, something far older and more malevolent than he could comprehend. His thoughts raced, each one tumbling over the other in a chaotic mess. Had Clara truly been taken? Was it him the house was after? The voice had been clear. He had summoned this, invited this force into his life. But how? How could he have brought this upon himself? The house was alive with secrets, and every inch of it seemed to bear witness to his mistakes. The door, the one he had come through just moments ago, now seemed impossibly far away. The hallway beyond was dark, but there was something waiting there, something that hadn't been there before. It was like a flickering light, a distortion, a presence just beyond the reach of his understanding. Ethan stepped forward, drawn to it against his will. His fingers brushed against the cool wood of the doorway, and the moment they made contact, a violent chill ran through his body, as if 1,000 icy fingers had brushed against his skin. The temperature dropped dramatically, and the air became thick with the smell of damp earth, like the scent of long-forgotten graves. It was all-encompassing, suffocating, and it made his lungs burn. The flickering light grew brighter, more intense, and Ethan's heartbeat quickened in time with the pulsing light. The door, once so solid, now seemed to beckon him, an invitation to step into a new world. A world where time no longer held any meaning. A world where Clara's absence was no longer the most terrifying thing. There was something on the other side of that door, something alive. He could feel it, and though every part of him screamed to run, to flee from whatever darkness awaited him, his feet betrayed him, carrying him into the void. The moment his hand touched the doorknob, the world around him seemed to dissolve. A cold, unearthly wind rushed past him, filling the room with a deafening roar that drowned out his thoughts. The door creaked open, slow and deliberate, revealing the void beyond. It wasn't a room, at least not one he recognized. The walls were distorted, their shapes shifting like water, bending in unnatural curves. The floor was a mirror, reflecting nothing but darkness. There were no windows, no doors, only the endless stretch of shadow, pressing in from all sides. A single faint light hung in the center of the room, pulsating like the heartbeat of the house itself. He stepped forward, the sensation of being drawn deeper into the dark abyss overwhelming him. His mind screamed at him to turn back, but his body refused to listen. There was something pulling him forward, something impossible to resist. Each step felt like a leap deeper into an unknown void, and with each passing moment, he could feel the weight of the house pressing closer, the oppressive silence closing in on him like a shroud. As he moved, the shadows began to shift around him, taking on forms that seemed to flicker and warp, like the remnants of a dream. He saw faces, horrible, distorted faces, swirling in the darkness, their mouths agape in silent screams. Their eyes were hollow, empty, yet they seemed to watch him, tracking his every move with a malevolent intent. And then, a sound, a soft, whimpering cry, rose from the depths of the darkness. It was a familiar sound, one that sent a cold shiver down his spine. Clara. Her voice, weak and broken, echoed in his ears. Ethan. It was her, or at least it sounded like her, the way her voice trembled, as though she were calling out from a far-off place, reaching out to him from beyond the veil. But something about it was wrong. The voice didn't belong to Clara anymore. It was like a mockery of her, a twisted imitation of everything she had once been. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he pressed forward, the flickering light growing brighter, pulling him deeper into the shadows. Each step felt like it was leading him closer to the edge of the abyss, to the place where reality broke apart, and everything ceased to exist. The voices grew louder now, distorted, incomprehensible. They were all around him, swirling and merging together in a cacophony of despair. They were the whispers of the house, of the forgotten souls trapped within its walls, of those who had come before him and lost themselves to the darkness. Ethan! The voice called again, but this time it was different. It was louder, more urgent. And when he turned, he saw her. Clara. But not Clara as he remembered her. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and black as the night itself. Her face was pale, her lips cracked and dry, her hair matted and lifeless. She stood in the center of the room, her arms outstretched toward him, her mouth moving as if to speak, but no sound came out. Ethan's legs gave way, and he collapsed to his knees. The room spun around him, the shadows closing in, the voices growing louder, faster, until they were deafening. The faces in the darkness merged together, becoming one indistinct mass of torment and rage. He could feel the house consuming him. It was pulling him in, devouring his mind, his soul, his very existence. He had been foolish to think he could escape, to think he could leave. The house had claimed him now, and there was no turning back. Clara's face twisted into a grin that wasn't hers. It was something darker, something more monstrous. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment he saw the truth behind them, the truth of what had happened to her. She was gone, and in her place stood something else, something far worse. The light flickered one last time, and the room went dark. Chapter 10. The Last Breath of the Lost. The silence was suffocating, a heavy, pressing weight that seemed to hang in the air like a dark cloud waiting to burst. Ethan's mind swirled with chaos, each thought a jagged shard of broken glass, cutting into his consciousness. His breath was shallow, his lungs struggling to draw in air, as if the very atmosphere was thickening, becoming heavier with each passing second. His limbs felt like lead, weighed down by something far beyond exhaustion. The room, the house, felt alive, its pulse matching the frantic beat of his heart, each thrum of the darkness tightening its grip around his soul. His body trembled as he forced himself to stand, the floor beneath him slick and cold, as though it too had succumbed to the curse that twisted this place into something no longer of this world. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that could offer him an escape. But the shadows, thick and impenetrable, closed in around him. He could see nothing, hear nothing, except the sound of his own breath, ragged and desperate. Then, a soft sound, a whisper, broke through the silence, a faint, broken cry that seemed to come from all directions at once. Ethan. It was her again. Clara's voice, but it was different now, hollow and torn, as though it had been dragged from the depths of some forgotten nightmare. The way it slithered through the air, twisting and warping with each syllable, sent a fresh wave of dread crashing over him. She was here, but she wasn't. This thing, this hollow version of her was all that remained. A wraith in the shape of the woman he once loved. He had to leave. He had to get out of here, out of this nightmare before it consumed him too. His legs shook as he stumbled forward, his mind clawing for something familiar, something real to hold on to. But the walls, the floor, the very air had become a shifting, living thing. The house was alive, a grotesque reflection of something ancient and unfathomable, and it was pulling him deeper into its dark heart. You cannot leave. The voice was sharper now, more commanding, as though the house itself was speaking through Clara's twisted form. Ethan stopped in his tracks, his blood running cold. His heart stuttered in his chest as he turned to face the thing that had once been his fiancée. Clara stood there, her body contorted in ways that were impossible for a human to achieve, her limbs bent at unnatural angles, her face frozen in a grotesque smile that was too wide, too wrong. Her eyes, once filled with warmth and affection, were now empty sockets, black as the void, staring through him with a cold, unfeeling intensity. "You brought her here," the voice continued, its tone mocking, cruel. "You summoned me, and now you will stay. Forever." Ethan could feel the darkness closing in, the weight of it pressing against his chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. The walls seemed to pulse, as though the house was alive with an insatiable hunger. And it wanted him. It wanted all of him. And Clara's twisted form, was its messenger, its agent in the real world, a being that had once been human, but had long since been consumed by the house's darkness. The memories of their time together, of their love, flashed before his eyes like a cruel trick. Clara's laughter, her touch, the way she would smile at him with her bright, loving eyes. But that was gone now. She was gone, replaced by this thing, this shadow, this mockery of the woman he had once known. He could see it now. Her soul had been consumed, swallowed whole by the house, and now only the shell remained, carrying out its master's will. "You cannot run from what you have awoken," Clara's voice whispered again, the words slithering into his mind like poison. "We are one now, forever." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, the terror clawing at his insides. He could feel the floor beneath him tremble, the walls vibrating with an unnatural force. The house was alive, and it was angry. The thing that had once been Clara took a step toward him, her limbs twitching in unsettling jerks. With every movement, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper, until Ethan was enveloped in darkness. He could feel the pull of it, like a vortex, a maelstrom of evil that dragged him closer, pulled him toward the very core of the house, toward the heart of its power. And Clara, no, this creature, was the gatekeeper, the last line of defense against the flood of souls that the house had claimed over the centuries. "You are mine now." Her words were clear, final. There was no escaping them. "All that you were, all that you loved, will be mine, until nothing remains but the void." Ethan's mind screamed for release, his body fighting against the pull, but his strength was failing him. The shadows coiled around his legs, tightening like chains, pulling him down to the floor. He couldn't move. The darkness was suffocating, devouring him from all sides, and Clara's twisted form loomed over him, a mocking grin stretching across her face. "You cannot escape. You will be forgotten." And then, as if the very air around him had been drained of all warmth, the house exhaled. The room around him collapsed inward, the walls closing in on him like a coffin. Ethan's chest tightened, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps as the weight of the house, of the darkness, crushed him from all sides. He could hear the whispering voices again, a chorus of tortured souls, their words incomprehensible but filled with anguish and pain. The house was a prison, and he was its final prisoner. His mind, fractured by terror, was no longer his own. He had become part of the house now, part of the horror that lurked within its walls. The darkness claimed him. Ethan's scream was swallowed whole by the shadows, lost to time, as the house settled into its eternal stillness once more. The last breath of the lost echoed through the empty halls, a mournful wail that would be heard by no one. The final breath of the forgotten Ethan's name would fade into the mists of time, a whisper carried on the winds of forgotten souls. The house stood as it always had, an imposing, decaying structure, its windows like empty eyes staring out into the void. The very earth around it had withered, and the trees that once stood proud and tall now crouched like sentinels guarding a graveyard, their limbs twisted and gnarled by the same dark influence that had claimed Clara. And now, Ethan. Inside, the silence reigned supreme, but it was a silence that thrummed with an unsettling presence. The shadows had settled into the very bones of the house, and the whispers of the lost souls echoed in every creaking floorboard, every crack in the walls. The house had grown stronger, fed by the fear and despair of those who had come before, and it would continue to thrive, a place of eternal hunger and sorrow. The curse had not been lifted. It never would be. Clara's hollow, twisted form still wandered the house, her eyes empty and devoid of any semblance of the woman she had once been. She had become one with the darkness, her very soul consumed by the house's unrelenting power. She no longer remembered who she had been or why she had ever loved. All that remained was the hunger, the insatiable need to claim more, to draw others into the same void she had fallen into. In the end, the house had won. The shadows had claimed what they wanted, and Clara, though she had once been a victim, had now become its willing agent, its keeper, an eternal servant to the darkness that ruled within the walls. Ethan had joined her, another soul swallowed whole, another victim of the house's cursed, insidious grip. As the years passed, the house became nothing more than a distant rumor. No one dared approach it anymore, for the legend of its horrors had spread far and wide. Yet, deep within the rotting foundation, there was always the faintest flicker of life, a soft whisper, a flicker of movement in the corners of the dark rooms, cloaked figures, mere shadows that seemed to watch the living from afar. The house would wait, as it always had. The souls it had claimed would remain trapped in its clutches, endlessly circling the same torment. their cries fading into the very fabric of the walls. It was a place of eternal despair, and no matter how far the world moved forward, the curse would never be broken. And so, the house stood alone, its windows dark, its doors closed to the outside world. But somewhere, deep within its haunted halls, the lost souls of Clara and Ethan, and those who had come before them, still lingered, waiting for the next unwitting visitor, the next soul to hear the whispers in the dark, the next soul to lose everything to the endless hunger of the forgotten house.